Now, when you made the decision to go online and Google tight ends, I'm sure you were hoping for somebody better looking than myself. But let me tell you this, what I lack in beauty, I make up with a really big brain. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Today we're talking about tight ends, the football kind, and our top 15 rankings for week 6. Now, anyone who's playing fantasy football this year just knows that the tight end position is an absolute crapshoot. We have a handful of guys we feel okay starting, but after that, we have no idea what's about to happen. Really, the only thing we can do is play the odds. Find the guys who get the opportunities, throw them into our lineups, and just hope they hit. So let's go ahead and dive into this week's rankings. But I guess I can start off by going through a few of my hits or misses first from last week. Even though there's nothing earth-shattering here, obviously Brock Bowers, George Kittle, Jake Ferguson, they were all highly ranked last week. They finished highly in week 5, and then misses. I guess Kyle Pitts decided to show up and play football last week. Wasn't expecting that type of production, but I don't think anybody was really expecting for Kirk Cousins to throw for 500 yards either. And then Dalton Kincaid. Now, no, I didn't miss on him because he outperformed my expectations. It's the exact opposite. I expected a lot more with no Khalil Shakir. But honestly, the entire passing game in Buffalo looked horrendous last week, and Dalton Kincaid ended up being one of my bigger misses. But let's go ahead and bring up the rankings and look at tier 1 here, where I have George Kittle, Trey McBride, Brock Bowers, Jake Ferguson, and Tucker Kraft. For George Kittle, he's the current tight end 2 overall in the season. He's even missed a game this year. But he's had 12 plus fantasy points over his last 3 games played, and he's scored a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 regular season games against the Seattle Seahawks. Now on the year, Seattle's allowing 8 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and I think we can all agree, this year, 8 points from a tight end isn't all that bad. Now after him, it's Trey McBride going up against Green Bay. He missed week 4 with a concussion, but came back to an immediate target share, had 9 targets, 6 catches, and 53 yards last week against San Francisco. Now he gets to go up against Green Bay, who allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and he's going to be one of the leading target receivers in this offense in Arizona once again. Then we got Brock Bowers going up against Pittsburgh. He is the current tight end 1 overall in fantasy football, and it sure is helping him that Devontae Adams is not playing right now. In fact, he's the only tight end to play all 5 games this season so far and average over 10 fantasy points per game. In a matchup going up against Pittsburgh, they allow 8.5 fantasy points per game, but Brock Bowers cannot be sit for any reason. Then we have Jake Ferguson going up against Detroit, the current tight end 6. He's had over 8 fantasy points now in 3 straight ball games, 7 plus targets in each of his last 3 games. Brandon Cooks is still out. The run game in Dallas is still below average overall, and it's super hard to run on Detroit, so they're going to have to throw the football. Now, even though Detroit gives up points in bunches to the wide receiver position, they are pretty good against opposing tight ends. They allow the 9th fewest fantasy points per game, but with that target share, Jake Ferguson needs to be ranked this high. And then Tucker Kraft. He's got that matchup going up against Arizona. He's had back-to-back explosions, and because of those explosions, he's now the tight end 4 overall in fantasy football. He's had at least 4 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown in back-to-back games. He has that big playability. He's not just some dink and dunk tight end who's going to get you 4 catches for 40 yards. No, he can bust off a big one in this offense. Now, as for the matchup going up against Arizona, they allow right around the league average of 7.9 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. All right, let's move down to tier 2 now, where we have Kyle Pitts, Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, Pat Freiermuth, and Dallas Goedert. Now, for Kyle Pitts, he's going up against Carolina, and he is alive. Now, will he be consistent? Probably not, but who knows? He still has no touchdowns since week 1. He's only gone over 60 yards 1 time in a game this season, but now he's got a matchup going up against Carolina, who allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Given the way this offense finds success throwing the football, you have to think that Kyle Pitts is going to continue to get weekly volume. At this point of the season, with the options we have at the tight end position, I'm still rolling out Kyle Pitts weekly. It's more of a wing and a prayer, but it's better than some of the other guys on the list. Now, after Pitts, we got Sam Laporta in a matchup going up against Dallas, and he's the tight end 18 through 5 weeks of the season, and that is an utter disappointment. He is really suffering from Jameson Williams really being a thing in this offense. Listen to this, Sam Laporta has only had 14 targets total on the season. Now a matchup going up against Dallas, they allow 7 fantasy points per game, and if I had to guess, Sam Laporta owners would be pumped to get 7 fantasy points. After Laporta, though, we got Dalton Kincaid, who is a another disappointment in a matchup this week going up against the Jets. Now, he is the current tight end 13, but only has one game this entire season with more than 10 fantasy points. Really expected more from him last week without Khalil Shakir in this offense, but he has had 6+ targets 2 times this season, and both times were the last 2 weeks. But now a matchup going up against the Jets, they allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. It's not going to be an easy one for Dalton Kincaid. After him, it's Pat Freiermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, the current tight end 9. He's solid weekly, but it's a super low ceiling. He's averaging right at 7.6 fantasy points per game, but he does have touchdowns in back-to-back games. But do you remember earlier how we talked about Dinkin and Duncan down the field? That's kind of Pat Freiermuth, because he's only had over 40 yards one time in a game this season. In a matchup this week going up against Las Vegas, they allow right at his average pretty much 7.4 fantasy points per game. We could be looking at a decent floor game once again for Patty F. Now, after him to finish out tier 2, it's Dallas Goedert, and we got a couple big time weeks from Goedert due to the injuries of AJ Brown and Devontae Smith, but both of those guys should be back this week. With both of those guys back in the lineup and Saquon Barkley in the backfield, it's going to be really hard once again for Dallas Goedert to get consistent targets, especially in a matchup going up against Cleveland, who allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But let's go ahead and just finish it out right here in tier 3, where I have Dalton Schultz, Tyler Conklin, Isaiah Likely, Cole Kmet, and Evan Ingram. Now, Dalton Schultz has a matchup this week going up against New England, and honestly, this may be one of the first times we've talked about Dalton Schultz all season long. But with the injury of Nico Collins, he has to get more targets in this offense. In fact, he saw a season high in targets after the Nico Collins injury last week. Now, maybe if you're a Travis Kelce owner, you're looking for a bye week fill-in, Dalton Schultz and this potential increase in targets could be an option for you. How about Tyler Conklin? He's going up against Buffalo. The current tight end 15 has 8+ fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 ball games, but most importantly is he has 8+ targets in back-to-back games. How does this offense really respond, though, to the firing of head coach Robert Saleh? Now, the Buffalo defense is pretty average against opposing tight ends, but I really expect this offense in New York to rely on their studs this week in this matchup. What a better way to right the ship than a win against Buffalo? And to do it, really rely on your studs, Aaron Rodgers, Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, to do it. Now, after Tyler Conklin, I got Isaiah Likely. He's got a matchup going up against Washington, and of course, he made an appearance last week after 3 straight duds in a lot of people's lineups. But here's what's crazy. He only had 13 yards receiving last week. He was saved by 2 touchdowns. I'd rather chase targets than touchdowns. He's still super hard to trust on a weekly basis, especially since Washington allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. What about Cole Kmet? He's going up against Jacksonville, and he's really hard to trust with all the other receiving options in Chicago. Kmet's only had 1 good game all season, only 1 touchdown, and 1 game over 60 yards receiving. And really it's because he's not getting enough targets. He hasn't had over 4 targets in back-to-back games now. It's a solid matchup. I just don't know if the usage will be there. Then we have Evan Ingram going against Chicago. It sounds like there's a chance for him to return from his hamstring injury this week. Now, we all know that in the past, Trevor Lawrence has had no issues looking his way quite often. But I also have to expect him to be worked back in slowly. I can't expect Evan Ingram in his first game back from a hamstring injury to be a top 5 tight end in fantasy football. However, if you've had him stashed for a few weeks, this could be the time that you can get him back into your lineup. So there you have the top 15 tight ends for week 6 fantasy football. And like I said, I'm pretty sure you can see it, but after the first 5 guys or so, it's really a crapshoot at this position. We have to chase targets. The only way these guys can get fantasy points is to catch the football. The only way they can catch the football is if they're being thrown the football. So let's just chase the volume and see what happens in week 6. Now, if you enjoyed today's show, do me a favor, hit the like button down below and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day, but hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same.